story this evening, the lead story on the India development debate, which is the N word which has entered this conflict in a very strong way. I'm talking about nuclear escalation and the fears of that. So just giving you a sense of some of the key nuclear installations and nuclear plants in Ukraine, and this one right here close to Crimea, Zaporizhzhia, I hope I'm pronouncing this correctly, was essentially captured by the Russian military today. Remember, they already have control of Chernobyl, but a fire was reported near the plant due to an attack by Russian troops. First, it was reported it was in the plant, but then it was a training facility close to the plant which had caught fire. The IAEA and all the international agencies which monitor, nuclear plants say that there is no increase in level of radiation, but now Russian troops do have hold of the largest nuclear plant in Europe, which is where these concerns are now increasing. Now, what happens next is the real question. Is this conflict going to take an ugly turn? Is there any sign really of de-escalation so far? To speak more on this, I'm joined now by Rick Rossow, Wadhwani Chair in U.S. India Policy Studies at CSIS. Sushant Sareen, Senior Fellow at ORF, joins us on the show today. And Meera Shankar, former Ambassador to the United States, also with us on the show. Welcome to all of you and thank you so much for speaking with us. Rick, just your opening comments on the turn of events since this morning. I'm speaking in India timelines, but since we heard of the capture of the nuclear plant, is this a huge matter of concern right now, and is this the point that everyone's watching very carefully?
Well, I think, for me in the East Coast time zone, the news is I was going to sleep last night was far, far worse, where it looked like the nuclear reactors themselves were under attack, being shelled and on fire. So to wake up today and see that it was a building nearby, that the site's been captured, I'd say it's probably a bit less threatening than what we saw last night. But, going after Ukraine's critical infrastructure like this, we really do see, the pincer move, the strangulation of a lot of vital assets that would allow Ukraine to, maintain momentum, because this was not a shock and awe campaign where Russia was able to grab, big parts, capital cities and such immediately. So the question is, can Ukraine keep things up? And losing access to energy and such is going to mean a lot more as this continues to drag on. So last night's news was probably a little more concerning, but today's, for the long-term interest, is also very disturbing.
Just a quick follow-up there, Rick, because I've also been keen to talk to you about the impact that the sanctions were having. You will recall, and this war has now been on since about 8 days, that the first round of sanctions, which were announced by the United States, by the European Union, etc., were being seen more as a slap on the wrist. No one was believing that Putin will take them very seriously. Do you think that things have escalated enough now to actually bear pressure with the impact sanctions are having on the Russian economy?
I think now, whether or not, in a country where information flow is so tightly controlled by the government, the question is, how is this going to be portrayed domestically? We've got some access to that because, of course, we do have pretty good visibility on what the Russian government is telling its own citizens about what's happening. But, they are battening down for an impact. You saw the first wave hitting, oligarchs and things like that, Nord Stream 2 getting canceled. You saw a second wave where cutting Russia basically out of international financial flows. There is a third level of sanctions. Would we go as far as cutting Russia's energy contracts with countries, including to the United States? And so far, we haven't been willing to put it on the table, but it certainly is one more in the toolkit there. So, apart from kind of the non-military options, there still is more that we can do to escalate on sanctions. We'll see whether that has an impact. Russians have shown many times in the past they can deal with hardships that we in the West would have a really tough time considering. And making the way through it. So this is new territory for us for sure.
Yeah. Sushant, great to have you back on the show. Your take of the events of the last 24 hours. And is this real, this looming fear that we could have nuclear war? And this could have, this entire conflict could see nuclear escalation?
No, I think that's rather far-fetched. If you look at the position which NATO has taken. So, for example, just today, the Ukrainians have been insisting that NATO impose a no-fly zone over Ukraine, and NATO has refused because that would tantamount to a declaration of war by NATO on Russia. It's one thing for NATO countries to provide material assistance to the Ukrainians in their fight. It's quite another for them to start participating in it directly. And if that is not happening, I don't see, the threat of nuclear war or escalation to a point where it could lead to something like that. I think it's very small, it's marginal right now, negligible really. And the events of last night or today morning, I think, again, there's been a lot of hype about it, a lot of misinformation, a lot of propaganda warfare, a lot of information warfare is happening. And, there was a degree of alarmism which has been created about it. The fact of the matter is, if the Russians are pushing as they are going to capture all the critical infrastructure. They would want to, as Richard was saying, they would want to strangulate the Ukrainians to the extent they can, because that is the objective. But the kind of stuff which we are hearing, that the nuclear plant has been attacked and stuff like that. Look, the Russians might be many things, but they're not that stupid. If you were going to attack a nuclear plant and you were going to attack it in a way that you are destroying it, then the fallout on that, the Russian army does not escape that. So I think that bit is a little far-fetched. Just a little word on the sanctions bit. Look, number one, the sanctions are not a nuclear option in a manner of speaking, in the sense that they will immediately work. The sanctions will take time to actually start, affecting the Russian economy, number one. Number two, there was a time when the Russians were used to scarcity, like we were, Tamanna, Meera Shankar, me, perhaps you, we realized the time when there were always shortages in this country. My parents would still want to save $1. Just swipe my credit card today and buy whatever I want from anywhere in the world. But you ask the parents, and they will say, save the dollar, dollar is very precious. They simply cannot process that it's readily available. Russia has also moved on from what it was during the time during the Cold War era. It is far more integrated in the world economy. I am not very sure that over the last 30, 40 years, the Russians will be accustomed to taking the same level of pain which they were in the past. So I might be wrong on that, but I think the world has moved on from that era.
Just one point on what you said, Sushant, about how the sanctions will take time to show impact. Basic things have already started happening. Their currency has just collapsed. You have lines of Russians trying to get out cash from the ATM, trying to flee the country. So that pain is being felt in a very real way. It's not like it's very out in the distant future and, abstract.
No, Tamanna, what you are seeing right now is the initial impact, and a lot of it is sentiment, that all hell is going to break loose. So you try and buy whatever insurance you can, you buy as many dollars as you can, etc., etc. What you see in the normal Indian stock market when it tanks, when the other day it tanked by 2,700 points. If I had the money, I would have invested that day, because the next 2 days it went up 2,700 points. So a lot of it is sentiment. The sanctions.
Sure, but I, with all due respect, I don't know if we can compare. I don't know if we can compare. The tumult of equity with the kind of crack you've seen in their currency. Has long-lasting impact.
What I'm trying to say is that for these sanctions to really start biting, for that to start having an impact on employment, for that to start working its way through inflation, for that to start having devastating effect on Russian industry, on Russian businesses, that will take a few weeks at least. It's not going to happen overnight. Overnight, you're just seeing reactions. You're seeing the panic. But for it to actually start working through that system, I think it will take a few weeks, at least in my assessment.
Sure. Ambassador, I think the key point is, and something which Rick mentioned as the nuclear option for sanctions, when the Western world cuts off the gas contracts, and they haven't done that yet. Do you think that's telling?
Well, I think it's a very difficult thing for the Europeans to do, easier for the US, which is more or less self-reliant as far as oil and gas is concerned, especially with shale gas again becoming economically viable, with global oil prices having gone up to such an extent. So I think it's something which the Europeans would find far more difficult to do, particularly Germany, which will already pay the price for having agreed to deny clearance to Nord Stream 2, which would have brought oil and gas from Russia. If they are to find alternatives, and they are already looking, to put up terminals to import gas from other places, then the cost of that landed oil or gas is going to be far higher than what Russia was supplying them. So it's going to be a terrific economic blow to Europe as well. And therefore, whether there would be willingness to adopt a sanction which cuts both ways very hard, I think it would be a question mark as far as I'm concerned. I think what they're more likely to do is to expand the cutting off of more Russian banks from SWIFT, because right now they've done it with 7 banks, and then they could expand that. In fact, if you look at the way the sanctions have been structured, those banks through which gas imports are paid for and the transactions take place between Europe and Russia have been left out of the cutoff from SWIFT, at least in this round. So my sense is, rather than cutting off gas or energy exports from Russia to Europe and the West, the effort would be to perhaps expand the SWIFT. Because if you look at oil prices also, I think politically it would be quite hard for the US president to preside over a very steep rise in oil prices at a time when public disaffection in the US with inflationary pressures, which are now the highest they've been in a long while, is already very high. So, many of these things can actually boomerang politically. So I suppose that would have to be taken into account. But yes, there would be an effort to look at, how the sanctions could be increased incrementally. I agree with you that already, I agree with you that there's already been a kind of shock to the Russian economy to some extent, because the ruble fell by almost 30% in value. There was a run on the banks, and the Russian government announced an increase in interest rates to 20% to staunch that. And then you see the stock market has been closed. So there's some kind of an immediate effect which this has had. Of course, the Russians may be able to stabilize the situation after a point in time, but it is going to hurt them badly because, I think they probably also calculated on China helping them, go around the sanctions.
Which they aren't.
Which
they aren't really.
No, which they may do to some extent, but they wouldn't do it in a way that jeopardizes their relationship with the West.
Sure. Sushant wanted to come in quickly, please.
Yeah, just a very quick point. I would rather that the oil and gas sanctions are not put, because that affects us even worse. Look, already the Iranian out of the market. Okay, if the Russian oil and gas is also out of the market, that will have a major impact on the oil price, number one. Number two, if the Europeans stop buying Russian oil and gas, they have to source it from elsewhere. Where do they source it from? I think the simplest source for them would be the Middle East, which is from where we are importing our oil and gas. So there is not only going to be a price spike, there is a possibility of shortages as well. So I would rather that, if the Americans are continuing, or the Europeans and the Americans together do not sanction oil and gas just yet, I think that would probably help stabilize the market some. And some of the prices which we are seeing right now might start getting corrected. Otherwise, if those sanctions are put on oil and gas, maybe the prices are going to go up even more than what they are right now.
Absolutely. And, just allow me to push in a quick programming reminder here, since Sushant has brought up the very crucial issue of crude and the energy crisis at 10 p.m. this evening on ET Now. Please do tune in for Spotlight. We're focusing exactly on this, that can India brace for the oil shock that is surely coming our way. So do tune in for that. But let me come to you, Rick, on some of the comments that have been made on how far the West is going to be willing to push. I mean, what is the end game here? Everyone wants de-escalation as quickly as possible. No one wants this conflict to drag on. So where is that small opening?
Well, you do have talks directly between Russia and Ukraine, so far on very narrow things, right? Allowing people to be able to exit the country that want to, things like that. But, if Russia does stall out, which I don't think is quite as close as sometimes, a lot of Americans are kind of hoping for, if Russia does stall out, and ultimately they think that there's some way they can save face, if privately, Western countries that have adopted these sanctions do talk about a package where if Russia rolls back, the West will consider easing some of these sanctions. That to me, as I think a kind of a best case scenario, but worst case, which I think is probably a lot more likely, you're going to see the country pounded to the ground. You're going to see ultimately Russia standing on top of a nation that has been destroyed with most of its people having fled, trying to install some kind of puppet government that won't be accepted, continued partisan shooting, and a lot of pressure that's being put on as we arm Ukrainians that have fled across to other countries to go back in. Because already you see a lot of countries, the UK and others, are perfectly willing to let citizens travel and take up arms against Russia in that fight. So there are plenty of off ramps to de-escalate, but again, Putin's got to want to take these, and so far, no indication that that's under consideration.
Absolutely. I mean, let me just take that question to Ambassador Shankar very quickly. Is there a middle path visible? Because like Rick said, the conversations right now are taking place between Ukraine and Russia on these very narrow subjects. The big conversation is just really out of the window. Do you think that this is a time when possibly there are back-channel talks involving the United States and Russia, involving NATO nations and Russia at all? Or is there a complete communication cutoff?
Well, I can't guess whether talks are going on through a back channel or not, but certainly I think the one tiny positive is the talks between Ukraine and Russia, which have led to an agreement to at least create a humanitarian corridor for safe passage of civilians trapped in the conflict and for delivery of humanitarian supplies to populations which may be affected. Now, in such a grave situation, I think that's a plus. The second plus is that they have agreed to keep talking. So the talks have not broken off, and both Ukraine and Russia have agreed to keep talking. I suppose, moves towards any kind of a peaceful resolution of the problem or de-escalation and then resolution would emerge either if Russia is able to achieve what it wants and then finds itself bogged down, or it is bogged down before it is able to achieve its full goals in Ukraine. And on the other hand, if Ukraine the Ukrainians also see that this is destroying their country and that they're unable to staunch off or to stave off a Russian takeover, then I think things will deteriorate before there's a chance of getting better.
Well, it's a wait and watch situation right now. I want to thank all of you for joining us on the lead story on the show this evening. Sushant Sareen, Rick Rossow, Meera Shankar on the show today. We'll take a very short break, but when we come back, we're talking about what is happening with the auto sector. Remember, COVID was a huge hit for the auto sector. Is the Ukraine-Russia conflict going to be the next big hit for the sector. We've already seen the Feb data where there has been a drop, but it's not just the high crude prices. There's so much more that impacts the auto industry and a lot of headwinds coming their way. We're talking about that after this very short break. Stay tuned.